Okay, go ahead and record this then. This is on congressional reconstruction and the making of modern America. There. Overview of the slides. We're going to talk about Reconstruction, the main body of it, the congressional requirements of the South, what happens in the South after the white people leave or after the North grows weary of Reconstruction. We'll talk about the Compromise in 77 and the making of modern America. There you go. Considering all that, what do you think would have been the best possible result for Reconstruction for Southern Black Americans? That's a fairly good question. So I'm going to start by talking about the Radical Republican Party and its members. They were motivated by lots of things. One of them was altruism. To one extent, if you wanted to do the right thing by Black people, you probably were a radical Republican. But they were also motivated by punishing the South, a desire for vengeance. Many of the radical Republicans just plain wanted to get back at the South. Some of them looked upon Black people as votes, as politically expedient Republicans, that it was important to give the Southerners rights so that the Republican Party could win an occasional election in the South. So all that complicated set of motivations entered into the mix. And it was with those complicated motives that Congress passed those two acts, the Freedmen's Bureau Act, which extended the life of the Freedmen's Bureau to provide for schooling and hospitals for Black people, run through the U.S. Army, and the Civil Rights Act of '66, which was a way for freedmen to go right to federal courts with their cases and not use the Southern race-based courts that were denying them civil rights. So President Johnson vetoed both of those bills, but his veto was overridden by more than 2/3 of Congress voted for each of those acts, so they went into effect in the summer of '66. That year, Congress passed the 14th Amendment, the most important civil rights amendment to the Constitution. The 14th Amendment said that you are a citizen of the state in which you reside and a citizen of the United States if you're born here. It said that all citizens are entitled to the equal protection of the laws and that we can't have our rights taken away without due process of law. And that word equal in the Constitution, in the 14th Amendment, has been the subject of a lot of court cases in the last 150 years, and it remains the most important amendment, I think, to the Constitution. The Reconstruction Act of '67 is kind of the centerpiece of Reconstruction, when for a few years Congress tried to remake the South. Some Blacks were elected to public office. The South was required to change, and there were some teeth in this, so that Reconstruction really resulted in a change of policy for the country. So what this said was that the top date here, that the South would be broken into 5 military districts that was going to start over, and the start would be with martial law. And the top date shows the date of readmission to the Union, and the bottom date showed when conservative white Democrats came back in control. So you always see maps like this with Reconstruction. And white people said that Black people were running the show. And it's true in a state like Louisiana or South Carolina, Black people did make up a number of the important people who wrote the constitutions of these states. But for the most part, they were dominated by white people. And it's not true that it was overrun with Blacks, the inmates running the asylum, but that was the image that people had of it. And it was the Reconstruction Act of 67 that did that for most white people. So President Johnson was impeached in 1868 for opposing the congressmen in their plans for reconstructing the South, but he was not removed from office. And the 15th Amendment just made explicit that there would be voting rights for the ex-slaves, for the freedmen, that this too was part of Reconstruction protecting the rights of Blacks to vote. The redemption refers to, well, it is a religious term, but in this case, it refers to when white people got back in control of the southern states. The Ku Klux Klan had a lot to do with that, terrorizing Black people to the point that they couldn't vote without fear for what would happen to them or their families. So the Klan was put down eventually in 1871, 72, but for a few years they did their work and it worked very well. There was democratic white opposition to social reforms, and Redeemer governments were elected. Basically, the South passed their first public school system, and this required them to raise taxes. Well, white landowning Democrats didn't like that. They didn't like have their taxes raised, so they opposed the social reforms. The North wouldn't stay down there forever. They were growing weary of the cause. As the recession of 1873 took hold, as Northern racism began to take hold, there was less commitment to doing the right thing by Black people. And so in the South, you saw this tendency, a sharecropping and a crop indebtedness system emerging, where the price of cotton or any farm crop went down from year to year. And the crop lien system said that the farmer or the small farmer, the Black cotton picker, would pay off their debts first. And that was a recipe to keep them indebted forever, more or less. The Supreme Court retreat is best enunciated in Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896, where the court said that separate facilities were, but equal facilities were perfectly legal. And that was the law of the land, that separate but equal was brought to bear. The Compromise of 1877 was an agreement for the 3 states whose votes would determine the president in 1876. Pretty much Tilden won the election. He won the most votes. He won the states. But there was a commission formed because there were three states, Louisiana, Texas, Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida, whose votes were disputed. And so there were 8 Republicans on this commission and 7 Democrats. And the commission voted 8-7 in every state to recognize the legitimacy of the returns that showed that Rutherford Hayes was elected president. In order to get the Democrats to sign off on this result, they agreed to appoint Southerners to the cabinet, to spend money on internal improvements for the South, like the Southern Pacific Railroad, and to remove the last of the federal troops from the South. And so troops were put on trains in New Orleans and Charleston and put on trains to go shoot workers in the North, in St. Louis and Baltimore. The Army did not play neutral in labor disputes in the 19th century. They sided with management. And so the troops were kind of changing one war, one priority for another war, a war against fellow American workers. Well, in a lot of ways, this is the making of modern America. The Transcontinental Railroad, the land grant colleges, the high tariff, the banks, everything fit with the Republican Whig agenda, and they looked pretty big. The University of California at Berkeley was a big accomplishment. There was a Homestead Act. All these things looked very big, yet very little changed for Southern Blacks. Well, why not? Why did so much seem to change, but little really changed? Well, the 14th Amendment lacks teeth, is capable of being seen as an incentive to go this way, but it didn't require states to go this way. So the statutes lack teeth. The radical reformers also saw Reconstruction as the end of antebellum reform, that the sanctity of private property was enshrined, that Blacks picking cotton was the economic nationalism of the time, that Blacks' failure to make a buck in the new system was a result of their character not being fully developed. That's what white people said, that moral and material progress are related to the kind of character you have. So if white people saw African Americans sitting on the porch in the hot Alabama summertime, it was just another sign that they lacked the character to get ahead. And finally, the meaning of freedom for people was complicated. The founders would have seen economic independence as the key to citizenship, and many workers did too, the ones that went on strike. But this meaning of freedom became that as long as the slaves were free, as long as the government weren't telling them what their fate would be, then they were on their own. They were the government not defining them as slaves is all you can really ask from the government. So that meaning of freedom helped to, and the change in the meaning of freedom made white Americans see slaves or ex-slaves as their poverty being their own fault. So the pillars of the new order are the sanctity of private property, the sovereignty of the federal government, and the marketplace as the arena for social and economic relations. If you've got anything that needs to be worked out, the market will solve it. So the Great Railroad Strike of 1877 represents workers that held out for that older vision of freedom, that economic independence was central to. But soldiers that were sent north had a different mission, and that mission was to defend property, as we see. So I hope you've enjoyed these lectures. I wish you all the best of luck on the final exam. Good luck to you.